The stagecoach wheels ground to a halt in a shriek of worn wood and stressed iron, throwing up a final plume of thin, gray dust. Inside, Eliza kept her eyes shut for one last moment, praying the sickness of the journey would settle. For 3 weeks, she had been folded into herself, a passenger rocked by a relentless, jarring rhythm that seemed to have worked its way into her bones. She opened her eyes. Montana. It did not look like the promised land of the letters. It looked like raw timber and cold mud. A handful of buildings dropped onto a vast, empty plain under a sky that threatened an early, bitter snow. Eliza pulled her worn woolen shawl tighter. Her fingers, numb and stiff, found the folded paper tucked deep in her bodice. The letter. It was a map to her new life. The words from a man she had never met. Martin Hale. His promise. I have a good claim and a sturdy house. I am not a poet, but I am an honest man. I require a wife of good character. She had a good character, and she had packed in the bottom of her trunk a wedding dress of pale cream lace, sewn by her own hands. The coach door swung open, and the driver, a man who had not spoken more than 5 words since Omaha, grunted, "End of the line, Miss Stone Creek." Eliza gathered her valise and stepped down. The cold air hit her face like a slap. It was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine smoke and something metallic. The town was just one street, wide and rutted, flanked by a boardwalk of uneven planks, a general mercantile, a hotel that looked more like a barn, an assayer's office, and, farther down, the telltale bat-wing doors of a saloon. Men stopped what they were doing, unloading feed, whittling on a bench, cleaning a rifle, and watched her. She was new. She was alone. She felt their eyes like insects on her skin. "I am looking," she said, her voice sounding small and foreign, "for Mr. Martin Hale." The men exchanged a look. The stable hand, chewing on a piece of straw, gestured with his thumb toward a man walking out of the mercantile. "That'd be Sheriff Brody's business. Ma'am, he's the one found him." The sheriff approached, touching the brim of his hat. He was a broad man, his vest clean, his badge polished. He looked at her, then at her trunk being hauled down from the roof of the coach. "You'd be Miss Eliza?" he asked. His voice was smooth, too smooth for the rough-hewn town. I am here to marry Mr. Hale." She said it with a finality she did not feel, gripping her valise. The sheriff sighed, a practiced sound of professional regret. He took his hat off, revealing hair slicked down with pomade. "Well, now, miss, I'm afraid I have some grievous news. Truly grievous." Eliza's stomach, already sour from the ride, turned to ice. "News?" "Mr. Hale is dead." "Ma'am," the sheriff said, his voice dropping low. "We found him 3 days ago, out in that little shack he kept by the creek edge." She stood frozen. The dust settled around her boots. The sound of a blacksmith's hammer echoed from down the street, rhythmic and indifferent. "Dead, but the letter, he was hung, miss." The word was violent. It hung in the air between them, ugly and stark. "Hung?" she whispered. Who would—" "Oh, no, miss," the sheriff interrupted quickly, holding up a hand. "Nothing like that. Not foul play. An accident, a terrible accident. It appears he was standing on a loose chair, fixing a roof beam, and got himself tangled in a rope line. Slipped." He shook his head. "When we found him, well, it was too late. A most unfortunate thing." Eliza stared at him. An accident? A man tangles himself in a rope and hangs? It made no sense. The world tilted. She had spent every cent she had, sold her mother's locket, to buy the ticket to marry a man who had died from a clumsy slip. Where is he?" "Buried, ma'am. Proper. The town saw to it. We couldn't very well leave him." The sheriff put his hat back on. the gesture signaling the end of the conversation. His duty was done. "But what am I to do?" Eliza asked, the panic finally breaking through the ice. "My trunk, my things. I have no money for a return ticket." The sheriff's easy sympathy hardened just a fraction. His eyes flickered over her, from her worn bonnet to her dusty boots. He saw her situation plainly. "I am sorry for your trouble, Miss, truly, but that is not a town matter." He tipped his hat again and turned, leaving her standing alone on the boardwalk as the stagecoach, her last link to the world she knew, rattled away down the street. She was stranded, and the whispers started almost immediately. She heard them from the women sweeping the steps of the mercantile. "That's her, Hale's woman. Came all this way for nothing." A man drinking at the horse trough laughed to his companion. "Came too late for her use, looks like. A pity." Damaged goods. The phrase, unspoken, hung in the air just as the sheriff's word, hung, had. She was a woman for sale, and her buyer was dead. She had no place. She tried the hotel first, her hands shaking as she asked the clerk if he needed a laundress, a cleaner, anything. The man looked at her, his gaze lingering on her face, her body. "You're the mail-order bride, ain't you?" "I am a hard worker, sir. We don't have anything," he said flatly. Turning back to his ledger, she tried the mercantile. The proprietor, a stern man named Henderson, listened to her plea. "I can keep books, sir. I can sweep. I am very good with accounts." "Miss," he said, not unkindly, but firmly, "your association, it's unfortunate. My customers, the ladies of this town, it just wouldn't be proper. You understand." She understood. She was a scandal, a walking reminder of a dead man's private needs. By the time dusk began to paint the sky in shades of bruised purple and cold gray, a deep animal fear had set in. She had not eaten since morning. She had nowhere to sleep. A door opened nearby. A woman in a black bombazine dress, her hair pulled back so tightly it strained the skin of her face, motioned to her from a small, neat house. "You, girl, get in here before you freeze." It was a local widow, Mrs. Gable. Eliza had heard her name mentioned in the mercantile. A woman of some standing. Relief washed over Eliza, so strong it made her dizzy. "Oh, thank you, ma'am. God bless you." The house was dark and smelled of lye soap and boiled cabbage. "Mrs." Gable pointed to a thin cot near the cold kitchen stove. "You can have one night. One." "I cannot have you here longer. It wouldn't be right." "I understand. Thank you." "Mrs." Gable poured her a cup of thin, bitter chicory water. She stared at Eliza, her eyes small and sharp. "You came here for Hale?" "Yes, ma'am." "He was no good. None of them are." The widow leaned closer. "You seem like you have some sense, girl, though God knows why you'd come out here. Listen to me. This town, it chews up soft things. Do not trust anyone here. Do you hear me?" "Ma'am." "Do not trust the men who smile. Do not trust the men who pray. And God help you, do not trust that sheriff. Brody's got his hands in everything in this town." "An accident." The widow gave a short, harsh laugh. "There are no accidents in Stone Creek, only secrets." Eliza slept poorly, the woman's warning mixing with the image of a hanging man. The next day, the rejections continued. She was turned away from the small bakery, the seamstress shop, even the livery. She was a pariah. By nightfall, she was back where she started, only hungrier and more desperate. There was only one place left, the place she had avoided looking at, the Red Slipper Saloon. It was at the edge of town, where the respectable boardwalk dissolved into mud and refuse. Light, stained red by the curtains, spilled out onto the street along with the sharp, tinny sound of a piano and bursts of loud, false laughter. She stood outside for a long time, her pride warring with the gnawing in her belly. To enter a place like this was to confirm everything the town already whispered about her. It was a line, and crossing it meant she could never go back. The cold decided for her. Her fingers were beginning to burn with it. She pushed open the bat-wing doors. The noise hit her first. A wall of smoke, the stink of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and cheap perfume. Every man at the bar, every gambler at the tables, turned to look at her. Their gazes were blunt, assessing. They were not seeing a person. They were seeing meat. A large man with a stained apron and a heavy, drooping mustache emerged from the gloom. This must be the saloon keeper. Silas. "Lost, Missy?" he asked, his voice a low growl. I am looking for work," Eliza said, forcing her voice to stay steady, her spine to remain straight. One of the men at the bar laughed. "We got work for you, darling." Silas shot the man a look that silenced him. He eyed Eliza. He saw her good wool coat, her stiff posture, the terror in her eyes. "We ain't hiring that kind of girl right now," he said, gesturing to the women upstairs. "Draped over the railing?" "I am not that kind of girl," Eliza said, her cheeks burning hot. "I am a seamstress. I saw one of your ladies by the window this morning. Her dress was torn. The lace was ripped from the bodice. I can fix it. I can fix all of them. I am an excellent seamstress." Silas stared at her. This was new. He looked at the garish red curtains that separated the main bar from a small, dusty stage. He looked at his girls, who were indeed looking ragged. "A seamstress, eh?" He stroked his mustache. "I got a corner, back there." He pointed to the heavy velvet curtain. "Behind the stage. You stay there. You fix what tears. You stay out of sight of the customers." He leaned in. "You hear nothing. You see nothing. Understand?" "And lodging?" she whispered. "Room upstairs. Small. Got a lock. You'll board with the girls, but you won't work with the girls. Not unless you want to." "I will not," she said, the words sharp. "Fine by me. You keep the dresses looking pretty. That's all. Deal?" "Deal." He led her back. The space was hardly a room. It was an alcove, a dusty pocket of shadow hidden by the thick, musty curtain. There was a single stool and a crate. He brought her a kerosene lamp, a box of threads, needles, and a pile of brightly colored, torn satin and lace. "Get to work," he said, and left her. Eliza sat on the stool, on the other side of the curtain. The piano hammered out a tune. She could hear the men's voices, the scrape of chairs, the clink of glasses. She was hidden, but she was inside. She felt the humiliation sink deep, a cold, heavy stone in her gut. She threaded a needle, her hands trembling, and began to stitch a bright yellow ribbon back onto a bodice, trying to ignore the things she was already seeing through the thin gap in the velvet. She saw men grabbing. She saw the girls smiling when their eyes were dead. She saw coins changing hands for things that made her want to vomit. She kept her head down and sewed. Weeks passed. The weather turned from cold to brutal. Snow buried the town. Eliza's life found a rhythm. She sewed in her alcove, ate silent meals in the kitchen with the other girls, Clara, May, Belle, and slept in her small, cold room. The sound of the saloon a muffled roar beneath her floor. The girls were rough, but not unkind. They treated her like a strange bird, something fragile that had landed in their coop by mistake. They called her the nun. She fixed their clothes, and they kept the worst of the men away from her curtain. And then she began to notice him. His name, she learned from Clara, was Will. He came in every Thursday night. He never came on the rowdy weekend nights. Just Thursday. The first time he entered, the saloon seemed to grow quieter for a beat. Even Silas nodded at him, a gesture of respect he gave no one else. Will was a quiet man, with a face that looked like it had been carved from hardwood and left in the weather. A long, thin scar ran from his left temple down across his cheek, pulling at the corner of his eye. He wore denim. Not fancy suits, and his hat was stained. He looked haunted. He did not go to the bar. He did not call for one of the girls. He took the small table in the far corner, the one deepest in shadow. Silas brought him a single whiskey, which he rarely seemed to touch, and he watched. But he didn't watch the girls on the stage. He didn't leer at Clara or May. He watched the red curtain. The first time Eliza felt his gaze, it was so different from the others. It was not a groping, greedy look. It was still, heavy. It was a gaze that seemed to see right through the velvet. She found a small hole in the fabric, a tear she had purposely not mended. She looked through it. He was looking right back, not at her body, hidden in the shadows. He was looking at where he knew her to be. His gray eyes were steady, unblinking. He was not smiling. He looked, she thought, impossibly sad. He was watching her, the hidden woman, the seamstress. He never spoke to her. She never spoke to him. He would sit for an hour, nursing his drink, his gaze fixed on her hiding place. Then he would put a coin on the table and leave, vanishing into the snow. His weekly visit became the one solid point in her disorienting life. She found herself waiting for Thursdays. She would watch him through the hole. She saw the way his hands, scarred and rough, rested on the table. He never fidgeted. He just sat and looked. She didn't know his name yet. Not really. She didn't know his story. But she felt his silence. It was a silence that matched her own. It felt alive. It was the only time all week she did not feel like a ghost, or like a piece of meat. He saw her, the woman with the needle. Tonight was Thursday. He had just left. The saloon was closing. The chairs were being stacked on the tables. The last drunk was being shoved out into the snow. Eliza sat alone in her alcove. The lamp turned low. She was mending a tear in a blue silk dress, her fingers aching from the cold and the constant work. She was tired. She was lonely. She was ashamed. But as she sat there, she thought of his gaze, the weight of it, the simple, unnerving fact of it. It wasn't a violation. It was the opposite. It was a recognition. In a town where everyone either looked through her or at her with hunger, he just saw her. A strange, unfamiliar warmth curled deep inside her, low in her belly. It was a feeling so long absent she barely recognized it. It was not the heat of shame or the cold of fear. It was a low, humming ache. She stopped sewing. She looked at the curtain, at the empty space where he had been watching. She pressed a hand to her stomach, over the layers of wool and cotton, feeling that sudden, sharp, and terribly human throb. She whispered it to the empty curtain, to the shadows, to the man who was already gone. "I've been aching down there," she confessed to the silence. She closed her eyes, letting the truth of it settle. Not from shame, from being seen. The brutal cold of the Montana winter settled over Stone Creek like a shroud. The snows came early and stayed, burying the rutted street, muffling the sounds of the town, and sealing Eliza in her new life at the Red Slipper. She learned the rhythms of the place. By day, she stayed in her small, drafty room upstairs, mending the saloon's linens and her own dwindling wardrobe, the scent of stale beer and cheap perfume a constant presence. By night, she descended to her alcove, a shadow hiding behind the heavy, stained red curtain. The men called her the Nun. The girls, Clara, May, and young Belle, called her Eliza. Her hands were never still. She sat on her stool, the kerosene lamp casting a weak yellow circle, and stitched the garish costumes of the saloon girls. She replaced torn lace, reinforced the seams of bodices split by rough hands, and scrubbed stains from satin skirts that told stories she did not want to understand. From her hiding place, she was the silent witness to the town's underbelly. She saw the respectable men from the mercantile, the ones who had refused her work, slip in the back door. She saw Sheriff Brody share quiet, smiling whiskeys with Silas, the saloon keeper, their heads bent close in conspiracy. And she saw the desperation of the girls, their laughter pitched high and false, their eyes hollowed out by the work. She stayed behind the curtain. It was her armor. The men knew she was there, the saloon's little mystery, the seamstress ghost. But Silas had enforced the rule. She was not to be touched. She was not to be spoken to. She was, in her own way, as much a property of the saloon as the whiskey bottles. Her closest bond formed with Clara. Clara had been beautiful once. Eliza could see it in the fine structure of her bones, the pale blonde of her hair, now dry and thin, but Clara was broken. She had a cough that rattled her thin chest, a deep, wet sound that worsened as the winter deepened. She moved stiffly, her back and ribs aching from nights Eliza tried not to imagine. "You sew like you're praying, Eliza," Clara whispered one night, sitting on a crate beside the alcove while Eliza mended her favorite blue dress. The piano hammered away on the other side of the velvet. "It keeps my hands busy," Eliza said quietly. "Keeps your mind busy, you mean?" Clara coughed, a painful, racking sound. She spit into a rag. "You don't belong here." "Neither do you," Eliza said, her needle pulling the silk thread taut. A sad, brittle smile touched Clara's chapped lips. "Oh, honey, I belong here more than anyone. I'm what this place is for. I'm all used up. But you—" She looked at Eliza straight back, her neat, pinned-up hair. "You're still whole." "I am stranded. Clara, that is all." "I dream of leaving," Clara said, her voice dropping, her gaze going distant. "Just a small place, a room with a window that gets the morning sun. Maybe I'd have a cat, something warm that don't want anything from me. Just sit in my lap." Eliza's hand stilled. "You should save your money." Clara laughed, and the laugh turned into another cough. "Money? Silas takes most of it. For my room, for my board, for the dresses." She touched the silk Eliza was mending. "He says I still owe him for this one. From 2 years ago. We never get out, Eliza. We just get buried." Eliza felt a familiar, cold dread. She began to help Clara more. She would steal broth from the kitchen and bring it to her room. She would sit by her bed when the cough was bad, holding her hand, the two of them listening to the raucous noise from the floor below. And then the gifts started. The first was simple. She returned to her alcove after a brief trip upstairs and found a spool of fine silk thread sitting on her stool. It was deep blue, the color of a twilight sky, and finer than anything Silas stocked. She looked around. No one was watching. She hid it in her pocket, her heart pounding. A week later, left in the same spot, was a small tin of honey. The third, 2 weeks after that, was tucked under her stool, as if the giver was afraid she might miss it, a small jar of peach preserves. Eliza held the jar in her cold hands. Peaches. It was the food of home, of sunshine, of a life so far removed from this place it felt like a dream. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, who it was from. It was the quiet man, Will. He still came every Thursday. He was as faithful as the changing of the moon. He would enter just after dusk, shake the snow from his hat, and take the table in the far corner. He would order his one whiskey and sit. Eliza began to look forward to Thursdays with an ache that was almost painful. It was a secret, dangerous anticipation. She watched him through the small, mended tear in the velvet. She studied him. He was not like the others. He did not watch the girls dance. He did not gamble. He sat with his hat in his lap, his gaze fixed on her curtain. He just watched. He knew she was there, and she knew he was there. It was a strange, silent communion. He was watching over her. The gifts were proof, the thread for her work, the honey and preserves for her. He saw her as a woman, not as the nun or a saloon property. She had to know who he was. "Clara," she asked one night, while they were folding linens in the back room, The man who sits in the corner on Thursdays, the one with the scar. Clara dropped a sheet. Her already pale face went paler. Will, she whispered, looking over her shoulder as if his name might summon him. That is his name? Eliza, you listen to me. Clara gripped her arm, her fingers surprisingly strong. You stay clear of him. He ain't like the others. He's not safe. He seems quiet. He does not bother anyone. He's quiet now, Clara said, her voice low and urgent. Before he came here, he was a killer. Eliza, a real one. A gunslinger. Rode with a bad crowd. They said he was the fastest draw west of the divide. Eliza felt a chill. She thought of his still, scarred hands resting on the table. What happened? Why is he here? Nobody knows, not really. Clara started folding the sheet again, her movements jerky. He rode in about 2 years back, half dead. Looked like he'd been through a war. Silas knew him from before, gave him a room. But Will, he was different. The fire was gone. He sold his guns. Someone told me he just stopped. One day, he was the most feared man in the territory, and the next, he was just Will. Works odd jobs at the livery, keeps to himself. But there's blood on his hands. Eliza, a lot of it. Don't you go mistaking that quiet for gentle. The warning settled on Eliza, but it didn't change the way she felt when he watched her. It only deepened the mystery. The man who gave her peach preserves had been a killer. The man with the blood on his hands sat in a saloon and watched a seamstress hide. The winter ground on. Eliza had been in Stone Creek for almost 4 months. She had run out of her own thread and needed a button for her last good shirtwaist. Her main trunk was still at Mrs. Gable's house. The widow had agreed to store it in her attic, a small act of charity that allowed her to keep Eliza at arm's length while still feeling righteous. Eliza chose a cold, clear afternoon, when the saloon was quiet. She walked to the widow's house, her boots crunching on the packed snow. I need to retrieve an item from my trunk, Mrs. Gable, Eliza said, standing on the porch, not expecting to be invited in. The widow squinted at her. You are still at that place? It was a statement, not a question. I am. And you have not? I am the seamstress, Eliza said, her voice flat. Mrs. Gable sniffed, satisfied. Very well. The attic is cold. Do not dally. The attic was colder than the street. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light from a grimy window. Her trunk was there, in the corner, covered in a canvas sheet. As she moved toward it, she brushed against a stack of crates, a small wooden box, overloaded with papers and tintypes, tipped and spilled its contents across the dusty floor. Oh, heavens, Eliza whispered, kneeling to gather the scattered photographs. She saw faces of Stone Creek's past, stern women, proud men in stiff suits. And then, one stopped her cold. It was a tintype of 4 men, posing in front of the unfinished courthouse. They were smiling, arms slung around each other, full of frontier bravado. She recognized Sheriff Brody immediately, his smile slick and practiced even then. And she recognized the man beside him, Martin Hale. Her breath caught in her throat. This was the man she was meant to marry. He was younger, thinner, but it was him, and he was not the plain, honest farmer his letters described. His eyes were small, his mouth weak and cruel. He was holding a bottle of whiskey. She looked at the other 2 men. One was a stranger, heavy-set and bearded. The 4th man stood slightly apart. He was younger, but the hardness was already there. His hat was pushed back. A pair of guns rested low on his hips, a fresh, angry scar, not yet faded to white, sliced down his left cheek. It was Will. Eliza's hands began to shake so badly she dropped the photograph. It clattered on the floorboards. Martin Hale, Sheriff Brody, Will, they knew each other. They were friends. The sheriff, who had called Martin's death an accident, and Will, the quiet, haunted man who brought her presents. He had known her fiancé, the fiancé who had been found hung in a shack. Clara's words echoed in her head. He used to be a killer. He rode with a bad crowd. She felt sick. The image of Will's steady gaze on her curtain, a gaze she had mistaken for kindness, now felt sinister. Was he watching her out of guilt, or was it something worse? She picked up the tintype, her fingers numb, and slid it into the pocket of her skirt. She gathered the rest of the photos, put them back in the box, and fled the attic, forgetting the button, forgetting everything but the cold, terrible truth in her pocket. That night was Thursday. She sat in her alcove, the saloon noise a distant roar in her ears. She felt like she was underwater. She clutched the sharp-edged tintype in her pocket. Every time the batwing doors opened, her heart seized. Then he came. He shook the snow from his hat. He walked to his table. Silas brought his whiskey. He sat, and his eyes found the curtain. Eliza watched him through the peephole. He looked the same as always. Quiet, still, sad. But today, she saw something else. She saw a man capable of violence. She saw the man from the photograph, smiling next to Martin Hale. She could not breathe. She could not sew. The lie was too big. The man who saw her, the only one who saw her, was part of the darkness that had stranded her here. She had to know. Before she could think, before she could lose her nerve, she stood up. Her stool scraped loudly on the wooden floor. She put her hand on the heavy velvet curtain, and she pushed it aside. The piano music hit a sour chord and died. The laughter stopped. Every man at the bar, every girl, every gambler, turned. The nun had stepped into the light. Elia felt the dozens of eyes on her, hot and sudden, but she only looked at one man. Will. He stared at her as if she were a ghost. His face, already pale, went ashen. The whiskey glass in his hand trembled. He had watched her shadow for months, a silent, hidden thing. And now she was here. She was real. She was walking toward him. He stood up so quickly his chair scraped back, a harsh, screeching sound in the sudden silence. She stopped at his table. She did not tremble, though her insides felt like they were vibrating. She looked at his scarred face. She did not need to show him the photograph. She did not need to say Martin's name. He knew. His guilt was all over his face. She spoke, her voice barely a whisper, but it cut through the saloon like a razor. Did you know him? Will flinched. The muscle in his jaw jumped. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His gray eyes were wide, a storm of pain and old, familiar fear. He looked at her, and in that moment, she saw the killer Clara had warned her about, and she saw the broken man he had become. He did not answer. He could not. But the agony in his eyes, the sudden, raw shame that filled them, was answer enough. Eliza held his gaze for one more second. The saloon held its breath. Then she turned, walked back to the curtain, and slipped behind it, disappearing back into the shadows. A moment later, the piano player, sweating, struck up a loud, clumsy tune. The noise of the saloon rushed back in. Too loud, too false. Eliza sat on her stool in the dark, her body rigid. She heard his table scrape again. She heard his heavy boots walk to the door. She heard the batwing door swing shut. He was gone. That night, sleep would not come. She lay in her cold bed, the tintype on the pillow beside her. She stared at the cracked ceiling, the sounds of the saloon finally quiet. When she finally drifted off, the dream came, sharp and terrible. She saw Martin Hale, his face blue, his feet dangling 6 inches off the floor of the shack. She saw Sheriff Brody, standing in the doorway, polishing his badge, smiling that smooth, clean smile. And she saw Will. He was standing in the snow, watching. He was not smiling. He was not helping. He just stood, his face carved of ice. and as Martin gave one last, final shudder, Will turned his back and walked away into the storm. For 2 weeks, Will did not come. The first Thursday after their confrontation, Eliza sat in her alcove, her hands clenched so tightly around her needle that her knuckles ached. Every time the batwing door swung open, her breath caught, but he did not appear. The table in the far corner remained empty, a dark space in the smoky room. The silence from that corner was a new kind of noise, a hollow ache that settled over her. The second Thursday passed the same way. The jar of peach preserves was long empty. The blue silk thread was gone. The gifts had stopped. The gaze she had come to depend on, the one thing in her life that had felt steady and real, was gone. And in its place was the cold, hard face from the tintype, tucked in her apron pocket, the face of a man standing beside her dead fiancé. Her confusion and the sharp sting of betrayal cooled, hardening into something else, a cold, hard resolve. She had been a fool. She had let a man's quiet watching trick her into feeling safe. She had mistaken a killer's guilt for kindness. The sheriff had lied to her. Will had lied to her. The whole town was built on a lie. She thought of Martin Hale, the man with the weak, cruel mouth in the photograph, and the story of his accidental hanging. It felt thin, like ice over dark water. She had to know the truth. Not for Martin. She felt no grief for the man in the picture, but for herself. She had to know what she had been saved from, or what she had been delivered into. She began to dig. She did it with the only tools she had, her quiet demeanor, her needle, and the invisibility the town had already granted her. She was the nun, the saloon seamstress, a figure of pity and mild scandal. No one expected her to have a spine, let alone a purpose. She started at Henderson's mercantile, pretending to buy a spool of black cotton thread.
Mr. Henderson?"
she said, her voice soft, her eyes downcast. "You were kind to me when I first arrived. I have been thinking about Mr. Hale, the man I was meant to—" She let her voice falter, as if holding back a sob. Henderson, a stern man who valued propriety, cleared his throat, uncomfortable. "A tragedy, Miss Eliza. A terrible tragedy." "Indeed, the sheriff said it was an accident, that he slipped." She looked up, her eyes wide with practiced innocence. "It seems such a strange way to die." He did not seem a clumsy man, from his letters. Henderson stopped counting his coins. He looked at her, his gaze sharp. "The sheriff ruled it an accident. That is all there is to be said on the matter." "Of course," Eliza said quickly, taking her thread. "It is just unsettling to be left with so many questions." "Some questions," Henderson said, his voice low, "are best left unasked. It does no good to kick up dust. Good day, miss." She felt the wall go up. It was the same at the livery. She spoke to the stable hand while pretending to admire a horse. Was Mr. Hale well liked? The man shrugged, not meeting her eyes. "Kept to himself, had business with the sheriff, mostly." "His death was so sudden," she pressed gently. The man stopped brushing the horse. "Look, miss, he's dead. He's buried. Folks' business out here is their own. You're working at the Slipper. You, of all people, should know that." Everywhere she went, the same wall, silence, averted eyes, the practiced indifference of a town hiding something. She was kicking up dust, and the dust was beginning to rise. One evening, as she left the mercantile, Sheriff Brody stepped out from the assayer's office. He waited for her on the boardwalk, blocking her path. His smile, the one he wore for the town, was gone. "Miss," he said. He did not use her name. "Sheriff," she replied, clutching her small paper parcel. "I hear you have taken an interest in town affairs," he said. His voice was still smooth, but the smoothness was like a polished stone, hard and cold. asking questions about Martin Hale.
I came here to marry him.
It is only natural I would be curious. Brody stepped closer. He was a broad man, and he used his size to crowd her against the wooden rail. He smelled of tobacco and bay rum. Natural, he said, tasting the word. What is not natural? Miss is a woman in your position, stirring up settled matters. Mr. Hale's death was an accident. The town accepts it. I accept it. You will accept it. I meant no disrespect. Sheriff, disrespect is not my concern. His eyes, a pale, flat blue, held hers. My concern is order, peace. We have a quiet town here. I like to keep it quiet. He smiled then. A thin, tight-lipped gesture. You are lodging at the Red Slipper, a place tolerant of women in unfortunate circumstances. It would be a pity if that tolerance ran out. Do you understand me? The threat was unmistakable. He was linking her silence to her survival. He was reminding her that she was trash, and trash could be swept away. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs, but she did not look away. I understand completely, Sheriff. I'm just a seamstress, trying to earn her keep. See that you remember that. He tipped his hat, the gesture a mockery of courtesy, and walked away. She stood there for a long moment, her hands shaking. He was afraid. He was threatening her because he was afraid. She was right. She hurried back to the saloon, the cold biting at her face. As she climbed the back stairs to her room, a hand shot out from the hallway and grabbed her arm. Eliza cried out. It was Clara. Clara's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror.
What in God's name are you doing, Eliza?
She hissed, pulling her into the shadows of the landing.
Clara, let go.
I saw you, from the window. I saw you talking to Brody. He threatened you, didn't he? He's hiding something. Clara, I know he is.
Of course he is.
Clara's voice was a desperate whisper, cracking into a cough. Everyone in this rotten town is hiding something. You think you are the only one with a secret? You have to stop.
I cannot. I need to know what happened to Martin.
Martin? Clara looked at her with a mixture of pity and fury. You are doing this for him? He was not worth the dirt on your boots. Eliza, he was a monster. I know he was not a good man. I saw a photograph, with him, and the sheriff, and Will. Clara's hand flew to her mouth.
Oh, God, Eliza, no!
Clara, what happened in that shack?
Stop it!
Clara shook her.
You are going to get us all killed. Do you hear me? You keep asking these questions. And Brody, he will not just threaten you next time. He will silence you. For good.
He killed Martin, didn't he?
No, it is not that simple.
Clara was crying now, silent tears of fear.
You are kicking a hornet's nest, and the hornets are all that is keeping us alive. You will not just get yourself hurt, you will get Will hurt.
The words hit Eliza like a physical blow. She had been so consumed by her own sense of betrayal. She had not considered Will's danger. Why Will? Because he was there. Eliza, because he is part of it. He is trapped, just like the rest of us. Clara's voice broke.
Please, I am begging you. Let it go. It will not bring Martin back. Thank God. It will just bury the rest of us.
She let go of Eliza and fled down the hall, her coughing echoing in the narrow space. Eliza stood alone, her mind reeling. He is trapped. For 3 more weeks. Will did not come. The empty table became a fact of her life. The cold in her alcove deepened. The snow piled higher, isolating Stone Creek, isolating her. Her resolve began to fray, worn down by fear and the crushing, repetitive loneliness of her days. She sewed. She kept quiet. She watched Clara's cough worsen. She watched Sheriff Brody walk his beat, his badge shining, his gaze sweeping the street like a predator. And then, one night, he returned. It was not a Thursday. It was a Tuesday. The saloon half empty. The piano player listlessly tapping out a mournful tune. The bat-wing doors swung open, letting in a swirl of fine, dry snow. It was Will. Eliza's needle froze mid-stitch. He looked like a ghost. He was thinner, his face gaunt and covered in a rough, dark beard. His scar, usually a faded white line, looked red and angry against his pale skin. He looked like a man who had not slept in a month. He looked like he had been to hell and had not quite made it all the way back. He did not go to his corner. He stood in the middle of the room, the snow melting on his shoulders, his gaze fixed on the red curtain. Silas looked up from the bar.
Will, you look like death warmed over.
Will ignored him. He did not take off his hat. He walked across the floor, his boots heavy, and stopped directly in front of her alcove. Eliza's heart was a trapped bird in her chest. He did not part the curtain. He just stood outside it, his shadow falling over her. She could hear him breathing, a ragged, unsteady sound. Eliza. It was the first time she had ever heard him speak her name. His voice was a low rasp, like stones grinding together. She did not answer. Her hands were frozen in her lap.
I have to talk to you,
he said. Not here. He gestured toward the back of the saloon.
The storage room, please.
She looked at the curtain, at the imposing shadow of the man on the other side. The man who had lied. The man Clara said was trapped. She put her sewing aside. She stood up. She pushed the curtain aside and stepped out, meeting his eyes. The haunted look was still there, but now it was sharp, desperate. Without a word, she walked past him. He followed her. She heard Silas grunt, but no one tried to stop them. The storage room was at the end of a short hall. It was dark, cold, and smelled of sour beer, damp earth, and burlap. Kegs were stacked against one wall. Sacks of flour and potatoes were piled in the corner. Eliza turned to face him, leaving the door cracked open just enough to cast a single sliver of gray light across the floor. "You've been asking questions," he said. It was not a question. It was an accusation. "You've been lying," she shot back. Her voice was strong, fueled by a month of anger and fear. "I did not lie to you. I never spoke to you." "Your silence was a lie." She pulled the worn tintype from her apron pocket and shoved it hard against his chest. "You were his friend. You stood with him. You smiled." He looked down at the photograph, then back at her. He did not take it. "He was not my friend, not at the end. I rode with him, and Brody, a long time ago. That was before." "Before what? Before you stood by and watched him die? My dream? I keep seeing it. You, and the sheriff, and Martin, and you just watched." "It was not like that," he said, his voice agonized. He ran a hand over his face. "It was not like that."
"Then what was it like, Will?"
Her voice rose, sharp and demanding.
"Tell me. The sheriff says it was an accident. Clara says Martin was a monster. You bring me gifts and watch me like I matter, but you were his friend. What is the truth?"
He flinched, leaning back against a stack of kegs as if her words were physical blows. He looked defeated. The fight had gone out of him. "The truth," he said, his voice flat and dead, "is that Martin Hale got what he deserved." Eliza went still.
"He was not just a customer, Eliza,"
Will said, his eyes finding hers in the gloom.
"He was not a farmer. He brought women here. He was a trafficker. He would write letters, like he wrote to you. Promise them marriage, promise them jobs, and then he would sell them to Silas, to men in the mining camps."
Eliza felt the blood drain from her face.
"I require a wife of good character." She felt sick.
"Clara?" she whispered, the name catching in her throat.
Will's face twisted. "He brought Clara here, from back east. She was not like she is now. She was young. He broke her. He used her. And he beat her."
Will's voice dropped, thick with a self-loathing that choked him. One night, he beat her so bad she nearly died, right upstairs. That was when I stopped, riding with him.
My God,
Eliza breathed. It gets worse. He would not look away. He was forcing himself to say it, forcing her to hear it.
Belle,
The young one, with the dark hair.
Hale.
He was coming for her next. He cornered her in that shack by the creek, the one he was fixing. He closed his eyes, as if seeing it. She fought back. He was trying to force her. She grabbed a rope, a length of rope he used for his horse. She got it over the roof beam. She got it around his neck. He was on a stool he had kicked at her. He slipped. He hung himself, trying to get at her. Elle White's words from the dream echoed, hung.
So it was an accident,
She whispered. It was justice. Eliza. She was a terrified girl, trying to save her own life. And she did. And you? She asked, her voice trembling.
Where were you? The dream. I found them. I had been watching Hale ever since he almost killed Clara. I knew he was no good. I got there too late to stop the fight, but I found Belle. She was on the floor, screaming, and he was done.
You helped her. He was dead. I could not change that. Will's breath shuddered. Then Brody showed up. He was Hale's partner. He got a cut of every girl Hale brought in, every girl he sold. The pieces slammed into place. The sheriff, the cover-up, the lies. Brody was going to arrest Belle, hang her. He said she had to pay, but I still had my reputation then. The one Clara told you about. A bitter smile touched his lips. I told him no. I told him we would call it an accident, just like he told you. But why? Why would he agree? His partner was dead. Because, Will said, his voice a low growl. If the truth about Hale's death came out, the truth about Brody's business would come out. The trafficking, the money. He could not risk it. So he let me bury Hale in an unmarked grave. He let Belle stay at the saloon, where he could watch her, on one condition. What condition? That I kept silent, that I gave him my gun, that I became his. He holds it over me. He holds Belle's life over me. He owns us. Eliza. He looked at her, his face a mask of torment. He agreed, for a price, and the price was my silence, my freedom. It all landed on her, a crushing weight, the entire grotesque fabrication of her life. She had not been coming to marry an honest farmer. She had been sold. She was cargo. She was to be Martin Hale's property, to be used and broken, and then, perhaps, sold again. The humiliation she had felt standing on the boardwalk, the shame of working at the saloon, it was nothing. That was shame about her position. This was shame about her existence. She was not a woman who had fallen on hard times. She was a thing that had been bought, and her buyer had simply died before he could claim her.
So I was...
She could not finish. You were next, Eliza, Will said, his voice soft. He was going to use you, and then he was going to sell you. The strength that had held her upright for months, her pride, her anger, her careful digging, it all shattered. She was not a victim of a tragic accident. She was just the last piece of inventory. Her legs gave out. She slid down the rough wall, landing on a burlap sack, the smell of raw potatoes filling her nose. She buried her face in her hands, and the sobs that came were not the quiet, dignified tears of a grieving woman. They were the raw, ugly sounds of a soul breaking. All the cold, all the fear, all the whispers, all the humiliation, all the terror of what almost was, it ripped out of her. Will stood frozen for a beat, a man terrified by the pain he had unleashed. Then, slowly, he moved. He crossed the small space and knelt in the dirt and straw in front of her. He did not say, "Do not cry." He did not offer empty comfort. He just knelt. He put one large, scarred hand on her shoulder, Eliza flinched at the touch, but she did not pull away. The hand was heavy. It was steady. It was real. He just held her, a solid, silent presence in the cold dark, as she wept herself empty. A long time passed. Her sobs quieted. Turning to ragged, shuddering breaths, she lifted her head. Her face was a ruin, streaked with dirt and tears. She looked at him, this killer, this liar, this broken man who had protected a girl, who had covered up a death, who had watched her from the shadows. He was as trapped as she was. Her hand, shaking, lifted. She reached out and touched his face. Her fingers, calloused from the needle, traced the long, puckered scar that pulled at the corner of his eye. It was old and deep. He closed his eyes at her touch, as if it burned him. A single tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the grime on his cheek. "Why?" she whispered, her voice raw. "Why watch me? Why the honey? The peaches?" He opened his eyes. The gray in them was a storm of pain, a mirror of her own. "Because," he said, his voice thick, breaking, "I have done terrible things. Eliza, for money, for pride, for no reason at all. I have blood on my hands that will not wash off. I have tried." His gaze held hers, desperate, pleading, the gaze she remembered from the saloon, but now she understood it. "But you, sitting behind that curtain, so clean, so decent." His voice cracked. "In all this mud, you are the first good thing I have seen in I do not know how long. You," he swallowed, "you make me forget they're dirty." The confession hung in the cold. Still air. He was as broken as she was. He was as lost. She leaned forward. He leaned forward. Their lips met. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It was clumsy. It was chapped lips and salt tears and the taste of whiskey and weeks of pain. It was a tremor that passed between them. A shock of heat in the freezing dark. It was the first human warmth either of them had truly felt in years. It was two drowning people finding a single gasp of air. He pulled back, his breath ragged, his forehead resting against hers. "Eliza." She did not let him speak. She did not want words. She kissed him again, her hands moving from his face to his rough hair, holding him, pulling him closer. He stood, pulling her up with him. He did not let go of her mouth. His arms went around her waist, lifting her against him. He walked them backward, out of the storage room, into the main saloon. The great room was empty. The chairs were stacked on the tables. The fire was a bed of dying red embers, casting a faint, pulsing glow. The place was asleep. He led her to her alcove, her space. He stopped in front of the heavy red curtain. He looked at it, then at her. He pushed it aside and followed her in. In the tiny, cramped space, lit only by the faint red glow of the embers through the velvet, they faced each other. This was not the frantic, paid-for fumbling she had witnessed. This was not lust. It was necessity. It was the ache she had confessed to the curtain, the ache to be seen. He was the only one who had ever seen her. Slowly, his hands shaking, he reached behind her and began to unfasten the long row of tiny buttons down the back of her worn wool dress. She felt the cold night air touch her back, and she shivered, but not from the cold. Her own hands, just as unsteady, found the buttons of his worn denim jacket. She pushed it off his broad shoulders. She fumbled with the buttons of his shirt. Her fingers brushed the hard, scarred skin of his chest. They undressed each other slowly, quietly. It was not a seduction. It was an unveiling. They were stripping away the layers of who the town thought they were. The nun, the killer. They were stripping away the grime, the guilt, the blood, and the shame. When they were bare, standing in the cold shadows. He did not grab her. He did not move to take. He just looked at her,
His eyes moved over her face, her shoulders, her body, and his gaze was full of a terrible, beautiful awe. "You are real," he whispered, as if to himself. He lifted her and laid her down on the only soft thing in the room, the pile of mending, the torn silks, the cheap satin, the garish lace of the other girls. And there, in the dark, behind the curtain that had been her prison, they came together. It was quiet. It was desperate. It was a promise. It was two broken souls, clinging to each other in the wreckage, choosing to live. That night behind the curtain changed everything. It was not a beginning. It was an anchor in the cold, cruel dark of the Montana winter. Eliza and Will had found a small, breathing space of warmth. It was a truth that existed only between the two of them, a secret that had to be guarded like an ember. They did not speak of love. The word was too big, too clean for the lives they lived. What they had was something raw, a desperate recognition. They were two halves of the same scar. Their relationship began in the shadows, their meeting stolen in the dead of night, after the saloon closed, after the last drunk had been thrown out and Silas had locked the cash box. Eliza would slip out the back door. He would be waiting for her in the alley, a tall shadow standing between the frozen refuse barrels and the wood pile. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, the stars above them sharp, indifferent pinpricks of light. "You are cold," he would whisper, his voice a low rasp. He would not kiss her, not at first. He would simply open his heavy wool coat, and she would press herself against his chest, her face tucked into the rough fabric that smelled of hay, horse, and the faint, clean scent of snow. He would wrap the coat around her, holding her, sharing his warmth. They rarely spoke. Words were dangerous. They were the currency of the saloon, of the sheriff, of the lies that had stranded her. Their language was touch. He would take her hands, her fingers raw and red from the lye soap and the constant stitching, and rub them between his own scarred palms until the feeling returned. He began leaving things for her again, not gifts, but provisions. A piece of dried jerky left on her windowsill, a pair of thick woolen socks, one night a small, dark bottle of cough tonic. "It is for Clara," he whispered. When she found it, he understood. He saw her tenderness for the other broken woman. He did not just see Eliza. He saw the goodness in her, the things she fought to protect. But secrets in a town as small and mean as Stone Creek were like blood in the snow. They always left a stain. The whispers started again, but they had a different edge. Before, the townsfolk had whispered with pity or contempt, seeing her as Hale's woman, the mail-order bride left on the shelf. Now they whispered with a new, sharp judgment. "That is her, the nun." One woman hissed to another in Henderson's mercantile, as Eliza bought thread. "Looks like she has left the convent." "With him," the other woman replied, her gaze fixed on Will, who was standing across the street, waiting. "That killer, finds I suppose." Mrs. Gable, the widow who had given Eliza her first night's shelter, saw her walking down the boardwalk and abruptly crossed the street, pulling her skirts aside as if Eliza were carrying a disease. The town had condemned her, again, first for being a woman for sale, now for loving a man they feared. The noise of their whispers eventually reached the one man it was guaranteed to anger. Sheriff Brody. Brody did not like noise. He did not like sentiment. He did not like anything that upset the cold, quiet order he had established. An order built on fear, secrets, and the cover-up of Martin Hale's death. Eliza's questions had been bad enough. Her attachment to Will was worse. It was a complication. It was two of his pawns moving off their designated squares. He began to watch them. Eliza would see him standing outside the saloon in the afternoon, his polished badge glinting in the weak winter sun, his gaze following her as she shook out a tablecloth. He saw Will mucking stalls at the livery, his eyes straying every few minutes toward the red slipper. "He is watching you, Eliza,"
Clara whispered one morning. She was in her bed, her small body barely making a mound under the thin blankets.
"He is watching Will."
"Let him watch," Eliza said, her voice hard. She dipped a rag in a bowl of cool water and placed it on Clara's forehead. Clara was burning up.
"No, honey, you do not understand."
Clara's voice was a wet rattle. Her cough had settled deep in her chest, a permanent, painful tenant. She was thinner than ever, her skin the color of old parchment.
"Brody, he does not just watch. He acts. He pulls the strings."
Eliza's heart clenched. Clara was fading. The winter, the work, and the years of abuse had finally broken her. "We have to get you out of here," Eliza said, her tone firm.
"We need to get you to a doctor, maybe in Miles City."
Clara gave a weak, rattling laugh that turned into a hacking cough. She held a rag to her mouth. When she pulled it away, Eliza saw the bright red stain.
"Oh, God,"
Eliza whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "It is all right, Eliza," Clara breathed, her eyes closing. It is my time." "No." Eliza's fear turned to a sudden, cold fury. "I will not let you die in this place. I will get you out. I will get you to that room with the morning sun."
"You cannot, Silas."
"Silas!" Eliza spat, her shame long since burned away and replaced by a hard, protective rage. She stormed downstairs. The saloon was empty, save for Silas himself, wiping down the bar. "I am taking Clara out," Eliza announced. Silas did not even look up. He kept wiping in slow, greasy circles.
"No, you are not."
"She is dying. She needs a doctor."
"She is fine, just a winter cough."
"She is spitting blood." Silas finally stopped. He looked at her, his eyes as dead and flat as a fish. "Clara ain't going nowhere. She has a debt." "A debt? For what? For those cheap dresses? For this filthy room?"
"For her keep," Silas said calmly. "She has been here 3 years. She owes me for her food, her lodging, and her protection. The bill is $50.
Eliza felt like she had been punched in the stomach.
$50. It was an impossible sum. It was a year's wages. It was a chain, forged by Silas and Brody,
designed to keep Clara there until she died.
"That is a lie,"
Eliza said, her voice trembling.
"You know it is."
"It is what is in my ledger," Silas said, turning back to the bar. "You got $50. The nun? You want to pay her way out? Be my guest. Otherwise, get back to your sewing." She told Will that night, in the alley. The cold was bitter, the wind whipping snow around their ankles.
$50,
she said, her voice flat with despair.
"He is holding her for ransom. She will die in that room. Will
stood silent for a long time. He looked up at the black, starless sky. His face was hard, the scar on his cheek a pale white line in the dark.
"I can get it," he said. "How? You have nothing. You earn pennies at the livery."
"I have my horse." Eliza's breath caught. His horse, it was a tall buckskin, the only thing of value he owned. It was the only creature in Stone Creek that was his. It was his freedom. It was his last connection to the man he had been, the man who could ride away.
"No," she said. "He is a good horse. Henderson at the Mercantile has wanted him. He will give me $60, maybe $70 for him." "No, Will."
Eliza grabbed the front of his coat.
"I will not let you.
I will not ask you to sell your horse. The only thing you have left. I will not let this town take that from you. There has to be another way."
"There is no other way. Eliza, she is dying. You know it. I know it. I will find it. I will."
She would not let him make the sacrifice. She would not be the one to ground him, to trap him as thoroughly as she and Clara were trapped. But their argument had been overheard. The next day, Will was in the livery, grooming the buckskin, his heart heavy, his mind made up. He would sell the horse. He would sell his soul if it meant getting that look of despair off Eliza's face. "That is a fine-looking animal," a voice said. Will did not need to turn. He knew the voice. Sheriff Brody was leaning against the stall door, chewing on a piece of straw. "What do you want, Brody?" Will said, his hand continuing to move the curry comb in smooth, steady strokes. "I hear you are thinking of selling him," Brody said, his tone conversational. "Henderson, maybe—" Will stopped. He turned slowly. "That is my business." "No, son." Brody pushed off the door and stepped into the stall. He was close enough now that Will could smell the bay rum. "Your business is my business. You seem to be forgetting that." He reached out and stroked the horse's neck. The horse shied away from his touch. "You are getting sentimental, Will," Brody said, his voice dropping. "I do not like sentimental men. They are unpredictable. They make noise." "She is a dying woman. Brody, it has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with me," Brody snapped, his easy manner gone. "It has to do with Martin Hale. It has to do with a dead girl in a shack and the story we agreed on. The story that kept you from swinging on a rope right next to her. You remember that, do you not?" Will's hands clenched into fists. "I own that silence." "Will," Brody whispered, leaning in, "which means I own you. You are my man, my tame gunslinger. And I am warning you, you are getting too attached to that seamstress. She is a disruption. She is making my town untidy." "She has done nothing to you. She is making you do things, like selling your horse, like thinking you have a choice. You do not." Brody smiled, a cold, thin gesture. "You need to end it. With her, you need to let Clara die in peace. You need to go back to being the quiet man at the livery. Or I will. I will tidy this all up myself. And I promise you, you will not like my methods." Brody clapped Will on the shoulder, a gesture of false friendship that felt like a blow. "Do not make me remind you what happens to sentimental men. Will, there is no one left to cover for you." Will stood frozen, the smell of hay and his own cold sweat filling his lungs. The trap was sprung. He was owned. He told Eliza that night. He told her everything, the threat, the leverage, the cold, hard truth that Brody held his life, and Belle's life, in his hand. Eliza listened, her face pale in the moonlight. She did not cry. She did not rail against the injustice. Her eyes, which had been so full of fear for Clara, now hardened. The last of her softness, the last trace of the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach, was burned away. "He is right," she said, her voice quiet. "Eliza, he is right that we cannot stay. Not at the saloon, not under his thumb." She looked up, and her gaze was no longer that of a victim. It was the gaze of a fighter. "I am done hiding behind that curtain. I am done being the nun. I am done being his." "What are you saying?" "I am leaving the saloon," she said. "I am taking Clara. He cannot stop me from leaving." "Where will you go? It is the dead of winter. You will freeze." "No." She took his hand. "I found a place, out past the creek. That old, abandoned trapper's cabin. The chimney is stone. The roof is mostly good. It is nothing, but it is not his." "Eliza, that is madness. You cannot—" "I can," she said, her voice fierce. "I am a seamstress. I will walk to every respectable house in this town. I will beg them for their mending. I will sew dresses for their children. I will work until my fingers bleed. But I will do it from my own home, and I will take Clara with me. We will live. We will live right under his nose, and we will not be his." He saw the iron in her. It was the same iron that was in him, the part that had survived. That night, they moved. A blizzard was rolling in, the wind howling, the sky thick with snow. It was the perfect cover. Will borrowed a wooden handcart from the livery. They bundled Clara in every blanket they owned. She was limp, barely conscious, her breath a shallow puff of steam in the frigid air. They moved through the empty, snow-choked streets of Stone Creek like ghosts. Will pulled the cart, his boots sinking deep. Eliza walked beside him, one hand on Clara, shielding her from the wind. The cabin was a dark square against the white, driving snow. It was one room, with a dirt floor and a sagging porch. It was colder inside than out.
God will,
Eliza whispered, the hope wavering.
It is solid,
he said. He laid Clara down on a pile of blankets they had carried.
The chimney is stone. Start a fire. I will get more wood.
For an hour,
they worked.
Will patched the worst of the broken window with boards from the porch. Eliza, her hands numb, swept the dirt floor with a pine branch. Will got a fire roaring in the hearth. The smoke was thick at first, but then the chimney drew. A small, precious circle of warmth began to push back the dark, deadly cold. Clara, tucked near the fire, finally slept, her breathing shallow but, for the first time in weeks, not punctuated by a cough. Will and Eliza stood in the middle of the small, rough room. The snow fell silently outside, a white curtain sealing them off from Stone Creek, from Brody, from the world.
It is a start, Eliza whispered, her voice thick with exhaustion and tears.
It is a home, Will said. He turned to her. In the flickering, dancing light from the fire, he saw her. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair falling from its pins. She had never looked more beautiful. He did not speak. He walked to the fire, took his heavy coat from his back, and laid it on the floorboards, creating a small, clean space. He held out his hand. She took it. He drew her down, in the empty cabin, with a storm raging outside and a dying woman sleeping beside them. They made love. It was not the desperate, frantic coupling of the saloon's back room. It was slow. It was quiet. It was a promise. It was two people, stripped bare of everything, claiming this one small, cold piece of the world, and each other, as their own.
For 3 days they lived.
Will would come at night, bringing firewood he had found and whatever food he could sneak from the livery, oats, which Eliza boiled into a thin, hot gruel, and half an apple. Clara seemed to rally. The dry heat of the fire eased her lungs. She sat up, propped against the wall, and even smiled.
My room,
she whispered, looking at the rough-hewn walls.
With the firelight.
Eliza felt a flicker of impossible hope.
Maybe they could survive.
On the 4th day, Will was at the livery. Eliza was outside, hanging a blanket to air in the brief, cold sunshine, when she heard the horses. She turned. Sheriff Brody was riding up, 2 deputies flanking him. Eliza's blood ran cold. She ran back inside.
Clara, stay quiet.
The door slammed open, banging against the wall. Brody filled the doorway, his broad frame blocking the light. He smiled, his gaze sweeping the small, clean room.
Well, he said. The nun has a new church, a step down, even from the slipper, I'd say.
Get out, Eliza said, standing in front of the cot. Now, that is no way to greet the law. Miss Eliza. Brody stepped inside, his boots scattering dirt. He saw Clara, her eyes wide with terror.
Clara,
he said, touching the brim of his hat.
I am afraid you are in a great deal of trouble. Silas has filed a complaint. I did not do nothing,
Clara whispered. That is not what he says. Brody pulled a piece of paper from his coat. He says you have run out on your debt, a debt of $50. He is also claiming you stole a blue silk dress. That is theft.
She has nothing,
Eliza cried.
You know this is a lie.
It is a formal complaint, Brody said, his smile tightening. And I am here to serve a warrant. He nodded to his deputies. Take her. The two men moved forward. Eliza flew at them, scratching, kicking. No, you cannot! She is sick! You will kill her! One of the deputies grabbed her and threw her back. She hit the stone hearth, her head cracking against the rock. She slid to the floor, stunned. As for you, Brody said, looming over her, you are consorting with a known killer. You are harboring a thief. You are an accomplice. He leaned down, his voice a low, venomous whisper. I warned you. I warned him. I am tidying up. You are next. Eliza, your tame gunman cannot protect you. The deputies hauled Clara from the bed. She was so weak she could not stand. They dragged her out the door, her bare feet dragging in the snow. Eliza, she screamed, her voice thin and desperate. Eliza! Eliza scrambled to her feet and ran to the door. She watched them throw Clara over the front of a saddle like a sack of feed. I will be back for you, Brody said. He mounted his horse, spat on the ground near her feet, and rode away. Eliza stood in the doorway, the freezing wind rushing into the empty cabin. She was shaking, not from the cold, but from a rage so profound it choked her. She was still standing there when Will burst out of the trees, running. He had seen the horses from the livery. He ran into the cabin, his chest heaving. He saw Eliza's bruised face, the trail in the snow, the empty cot by the fire. Eliza, where? He took her, she whispered, her voice dead. Brody. He took Clara. He arrested her for theft, for $50. He said, I am next. Will looked at the empty cot. He looked at the bruise darkening on Eliza's cheekbone. The man she had made love to, the quiet, gentle man who brought her cough tonic, vanished. His face became stone. The scar on his cheek seemed to darken, pulling his eye tight. The stillness that fell over him was not peace. It was the absolute, cold calm of a coiled rattlesnake. He did not speak. He did not comfort her. He turned, walked to the corner where he had stacked his few belongings, and knelt by the loose floorboard he had fixed. He pried it up with his knife. From the dark earthen hole beneath, he pulled an oilcloth-wrapped bundle. Eliza watched, her heart pounding a sick, slow rhythm. He unrolled it. Inside, dark and heavy and slick with oil, was his gun belt, his Colt revolver. He stood up. He checked the cylinder. The metallic click, 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 the only sound in the room. He strapped the belt around his hips. The leather creaked, settling into a place on his hips it had known for years. He was no longer Will, the livery hand. He was the man Clara had warned her about, the fastest draw west of the divide. He looked at Eliza, his gray eyes now the color of iron, cold and flat. He is not taking anything else from us. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of tenderness. It was a hard, fast, violent promise. He turned, walked out of the cabin, and began the long march through the snow toward the jail. Will walked into Stone Creek with the Colt heavy on his hip. The weight was familiar, an old, cold comfort that settled onto his bones like a second skin. It had been years since he had worn it for anything but a memory. Now, it was a purpose. The snow crunched under his boots, the sound loud in the frozen air. He was not walking to the livery. He was not the town's quiet, scarred handyman. He was walking to the jail. The street was mostly empty, the cold having driven everyone inside. He saw Henderson through the mercantile window, counting inventory. He saw the doctor's buggy tied up outside the small surgery. He did not look at them. His gaze was fixed on the squat log building with the single barred window. He did not intend to use the gun, not first. He had given his word, in a way, to Eliza. He had promised with his body, in the cold of the cabin, that he was a different man. He would try reason. He would try to trade. He would trade himself, if that was what it took. He would offer Brody the silence he craved, offer to leave the territory, if he would just let Clara go. He pushed the door to the sheriff's office open. Brody was waiting. He was not alone. The two deputies, the ones who had taken Clara, were there. They were not sitting. They were standing, one by each wall, their hands near their hips. Brody was sitting at his desk, cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife. He looked up when Will entered, and a slow, satisfied smile spread across his face. "Well, now," Brody said, his voice smooth and welcoming. "The dead man walks. I knew you would not be able to resist. Will, you always did have a sentimental streak, and it always was your weakness." The trap was sprung. Will saw it instantly. This was not a negotiation. It was a summons. "Where is she, Brody?" Will kept his voice low. His hands were loose at his sides. "The girl? Oh, she is safe. In custody." Brody leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning. "Where she cannot be party to any more disruptions, like fleeing her debts, like squatting on abandoned property." "She is sick," Will said, his throat tight. "She will not survive the night in a cell. You know that." "That is a medical matter," Brody said with a shrug. "Not my concern. My concern is you." He nodded at the gun on Will's hip. "That is a violation of our understanding. You were to be a quiet man, and here you are, armed, threatening a lawman in his own office. That is a hanging offense. Will, a real one. This time." "I am not threatening," Will said, his gaze flickering between the two deputies. They were tense, waiting for the signal. "I am here to reason. Let her go. Let them both go. Eliza and Clara, I will go. I will ride out. You will never see me again. You will have your silence." Brody laughed, a short, ugly bark. "My silence? You think your leaving gives me silence? Your being is the problem. Will, Eliza's being is the problem. You are the last two people who know the truth about Martin Hale. And I," he said, "I'm a man who likes to tidy up." He scraped the knife clean and snapped it shut. It was the signal. Will did not even have time to reach for his gun. He had come to talk. They had come to fight. The deputy on his right lunged, not for his weapon, but for Will, striking him across the face with a closed fist. Will staggered back, his hand instinctively going to the Colt, but the second deputy was on him. They crashed against the wall, overturning a gun rack. Will was a fighter. He was strong, but he was cold, and he had not been in a real fight in years. They were younger, and they were ready. He threw one off, his elbow connecting with a crack of bone. He turned, but Brody was up now, pulling the heavy barrel of a shotgun from under his desk. The sheriff did not shoot. He reversed the gun and swung it like a club. The heavy wooden stock caught Will full in the ribs. The sound was a dull, wet thump, and the air exploded from Will's lungs. He gasped, falling to his knees, the pain a white-hot fire lancing up his side. "That is enough," Brody ordered, his voice calm. The deputies grabbed Will's arms, yanking them behind his back. Will fought, kicking back, but the blow to his ribs had broken something. Every breath was agony. They took his gun belt, the weight of it vanishing. The humiliation was worse than the pain. "I told you, Will," Brody said, standing over him. "I told you not to get sentimental. You should have listened." "Clara," Will choked out, spitting blood onto the floorboards. She is innocent." "Nobody is innocent, son," Brody said. He motioned to the deputies. "Not the cells. He will talk. Put him in the barn. Chain him to the post. Let him reflect on his choices." The deputies dragged him out the back, through the snow, and into the darkness of the jail's barn. It stank of manure and cold hay. They shoved him against the central support post, a massive piece of timber, and wrapped a heavy livestock chain around his chest and arms, padlocking it behind him. He was trapped, chained like an animal. He collapsed against the wood, the broken ribs screaming, and the cold darkness swallowed him. Eliza waited. She watched the sun set from the cabin door, the sky turning a deep, bloody purple. The fire was dying, and she had no more wood. The cabin was growing cold. He did not come back. The moon rose, thin and pale, and she knew Brody had him. She did not panic. The tears were frozen inside her. Her anger, her fear, it had all calcified into a single, hard purpose. She had to find him. She banked the fire, covering the embers with ash, and pulled her thin shawl tight. She slipped out of the cabin and moved through the trees, staying off the main road, a shadow moving through other shadows. The town was quiet. The lights in the houses were out. The Red Slipper was a pocket of noise and light at the far end of the street, but the jail was dark. She crept around the side, testing the door to the office. Locked. She moved to the back, and she heard it, a low groan, a pained, rasp-like breathing. It was coming from the barn. The barn door was held shut with a simple wooden latch. She eased it up, her heart hammering. The door creed. She froze, listened. Nothing. She slipped inside. The blackness was absolute. It smelled of hay and old leather.
"Will?"
she whispered.
"Eliza."
His voice was a broken sound. From the center of the darkness,
"Get out. He will be back."
"Where are you?" She fumbled in her pocket, her fingers numb, finding the small match safe she carried. She struck a match. The small flame flared. She saw him. He was slumped against the post, his head hanging, his shirt dark and wet with blood. His face was a ruin of new bruises, one eye swollen, completely shut. Heavy, rusted chains were wrapped around his chest.
"Oh, God,"
she whispered, the match burning her fingers. She dropped it and rushed forward, guided by the memory.
"Eliza, you must go,"
he rasped, trying to lift his head.
"Be silent,"
she commanded, her voice fierce. She had a small canteen of water from the cabin and the rag she had used on Clara's head. She uncorked the canteen. "Drink." She held it to his split lips. He drank, the water spilling down his chin.
He was waiting,"
Will whispered, his voice thick with shame.
"I walked right in. I failed. I failed you. Liza."
"You did not fail me." She soaked the rag with the freezing water and gently, so gently, began to clean the blood from his face. He hissed in pain as the rag touched his split eyebrow. "You came for us," she whispered, her tears finally breaking, hot on her cold cheeks. They dripped onto his face, mingling with the water. "You came."
I could not save her."
"You are not God. Will, you are just a man." She leaned in, her forehead resting against his damp, matted hair. The barn was so cold. He was shivering, a deep, racking tremor. She kissed his swollen, broken eye. She kissed the bruised, rising knot on his temple. She kissed his split, bleeding lip.
"You are the only man,"
she whispered, her voice breaking, "who ever touched me without taking." He made a sound, a low, agonized sob, muffled in her shoulder. His body tensed against the chains, his failure and his absolution warring within him.
"Eliza, I will break them."
"I know," she said, "but not tonight. Rest. Save your strength. I will find a way." She did not know how. She had no tools, no leverage.
"Clara,"
he breathed.
"he has her."
"I will see to her," Eliza promised, a promise she had no idea how to keep. "I will go to the doctor. I will make him." She stayed until she felt the sky outside begin to lighten, from black to a deep, cold gray. She kissed him one last time. "I will come back." She slipped out of the barn, a ghost in the dawn. She did not go to the cabin. She went straight to the small house with the Dr. Miller sign swinging on its post. She banged on the door. not caring who she woke. Dr. Miller opened it, his hair mussed from sleep, his nightshirt tucked into his trousers. He was a small, nervous man with spectacles.
Miss Eliza?
He stammered, his eyes wide, taking in her wild appearance.
It is Clara,
Eliza said, pushing past him into his small, warm surgery. It smelled of carbolic and dried herbs.
You must come to the jail. She is dying. Sheriff Brody has her, but she is sick. She is spitting blood.
Dr. Miller paled. He began polishing his spectacles, a nervous, fluttering gesture. The sheriff?
Oh, dear, I cannot. What do you mean? You cannot?
Eliza demanded.
You are a doctor. She is a dying woman.
It is a legal matter, miss, he said, avoiding her eyes. He busied himself straightening bottles on a shelf.
Sheriff Brody has given strict instructions. The prisoner is not to be seen, not by anyone, until the magistrate arrives. The magistrate? From Miles City?
That could be a week. She does not have a week. She does not have a day.
My hands are tied,
the doctor said, his voice a miserable whisper.
I am sorry, truly, but I cannot cross him. Miss, you do not understand. He has leverage on many of us.
Eliza stared at him. The cowardice of the town, of this small, weak man, was a physical thing. It was as solid as the chains holding Will. Brody did not just own Will, he owned everyone.
So you will just let her die,
Eliza said, her voice flat. I am sorry, he whispered again. Eliza turned. She did not say another word. She walked out of the surgery, into the cold morning light. She now knew. There was no help. There was no law. There was only Brody. And if Brody was the only power, she would face him. She knew where he would be. It was nearing 8 in the morning. He would be at the Red Slipper, taking his morning coffee and whiskey with Silas. She walked the length of the street. Her head was high. She was no longer a victim. She was no longer a pariah. She was a weapon. She pushed the bat-wing doors open. The saloon was quiet, but a few early drinkers were at the bar. The piano player was listlessly picking out a tune. Silas was polishing a glass. And Sheriff Brody was at a corner table, his hat off, a plate of eggs in front of him. He looked up as she entered. His smile was slow and cruel. Look what the cat dragged in. I thought I told you to. You are a coward. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the room. The piano music stopped. Silas stopped polishing. Brody's smile faltered. What did you say? Eliza walked toward him. She was not a shadow. She was a fire, her bruised face, her torn dress, her wild hair. She stopped at his table. I said you are a coward, she repeated, her voice shaking with a rage so pure it burned her throat. You hide behind your badge and your deputies, and you beat men who are chained. You lock up dying women. You are hysterical, miss, Brody said, his face hardening. He started to stand up. And you are a killer, she screamed, the word echoing in the stunned silence. You were Martin Hale's partner. You sold women. You blackmailed Will. You covered up a murder. And now you are committing one. You are letting Clara die. You are a murderer. Brody's face went purple. This was his saloon, his town, his secret. He moved fast. His hand, open, cracked across her face. The sound was like a gunshot. Eliza fell, crashing into a nearby table, sending glasses smashing to the floor. The side of her face exploded in pain. Get her out! Brody roared, his voice shaking with fury. Get this woman out of my sight. If I see her again, I will arrest her. I will put her in the ground. Silas and one of the drinkers grabbed her. They dragged her by the arms, her boots scraping the floor, and threw her out the bat-wing doors. She landed hard in the filthy, frozen mud of the street. The doors swung shut. The piano, after a moment, started up again. loud and false. Eliza lay there, her cheek bleeding, her body broken. But her spirit was not. She had spoken the truth. She had torn the veil. She picked herself up. She had one last place to go, the barn. She had to get Will out. She spent the day hiding, watching. The town was buzzing. The story of her outburst was everywhere. She saw the deputies, jumpy and alert, guarding the jail. Night came. She was waiting for the deepest dark to try to free Will when she smelled it. Smoke. It was not wood smoke. It was the smell of kerosene, of oil, of fire. She looked. A bright, unnatural orange glow was painting the clouds. It was coming from the end of the street. The red slipper was on fire. She ran. People were shouting, pouring out of their houses. The saloon was an inferno. Flames were already leaping from the roof, roaring into the night sky. "Get a bucket brigade!" someone yelled. But Eliza was not looking at the flames. She was pushing through the crowd, her eyes fixed on the saloon's upper windows. Clara's window. "Clara!" she screamed, grabbing the arm of a man running by. "Clara is in there! She is locked in!" "What?" the man said, confused. She is at the jail." "No!" Eliza shrieked, shoving him. "Brody moved her. He had her locked in a room. She is in there." A new, terrible understanding dawned. This was not an accident. This was Brody's solution. This was his tidying up. He was not just letting Clara die. He was erasing her. Eliza ran for the front doors, but the heat threw her back. It was a solid wall of fire. "Clara!" She ran to the side, to the alley, looking up at the window. The glass had exploded. Black smoke poured out. No one could be alive in there. She heard a crash from the jail, a shout. She turned. Will. He had broken free. The fire, the chaos. The deputies had left the barn to help with the fire. He had used the distraction, found a pry bar, and snapped the chain's rusted iron ring. He was running toward her, his face a mask of soot and fury. He still had the chains dangling from one wrist. He saw the building, saw her face, and he knew. "She is," he started. "She is inside," Eliza whispered. The building groaned. The roof collapsed inward, sending a volcano of sparks and embers into the night sky. Clara was gone. Will pulled Eliza away from the heat, holding her as she screamed, a raw, animal sound of pure, bottomless grief. The town watched the saloon burn, but Will and Eliza, they watched a funeral pyre. Dawn. The fire was out. The red slipper was a smoking, blackened skeleton. The ground was a gray, slushy soup of ash and melted snow. Eliza was kneeling in it. She had been there all night. Will stood beside her, a silent, chained guardian. She was holding something she had pulled from the edge of the ruin, a piece of fabric, wet and charred. It was blue, Clara's favorite dress, the one Eliza had mended. It was burned at the hem. She wanted a room with sun, Eliza whispered to the ashes. She looked up at Will. Her face was hollowed out, her eyes dead. But as he watched, something new lit behind them. Not tears, not grief, a cold, hard fire. "They do not care if we die," she said, her voice a low, rough rasp. "They just sweep us away, like ash." She stood up, clutching the burned silk. "But they will see us live." Will looked at her, at the woman who had faced him, faced Brody, and faced this. He reached out and cupped her face, his thumb wiping a streak of soot from her cheek. He kissed her, there in the ashes, in the cold, gray light of dawn, surrounded by the smoking ruins of their old life. He kissed her. It was a promise. "I will kill him," Will said, his voice flat. "No." Eliza pulled back. She looked from the smoking ruin to the faces of the townsfolk, who were now emerging, staring at the destruction. "If you kill him, you hang. That is his law."
That is his game. We cannot win with a gun. Will, he owns the law." She looked at the crowd. Henderson, Dr. Miller, Mrs. Gable, all of them. "But he does not own the truth." She started walking. Will, the chain still dangling from his wrist, walked with her. She walked to the center of the boardwalk. Right in front of the ruins, the crowd gathered, drawn by the drama, by the sight of the beaten man and the wild-eyed woman. Sheriff Brody was there, directing his deputies, acting the part of the concerned lawman. Eliza stood on a water trough. She held up the burned blue silk. "Look at this!" she cried, her voice raw. The crowd quieted. "You all see a fire," she said, her voice ringing out in the cold air. "I see a murder. Sheriff Brody murdered the woman in that building." A gasp went through the crowd. Brody froze. "He will tell you it was an accident," Eliza continued, her voice gaining strength. "Just like he told me Martin Hale's death was an accident." The crowd murmured. Henderson's face went pale. "I am the mail-order bride. I am Hale's woman," Eliza shouted. "But Martin Hale was not an honest farmer. He was a trafficker. He sold women. And Sheriff Brody was his partner." The shock was total. The silence was absolute. "That is a lie," Brody bellowed, striding forward. "She is a hysterical—" "Is it?" Will's voice cut through. He stepped forward, the chain rattling. He held up his wrist. "He did this because I would not stay silent, because I was there when Martin Hale died." All eyes went to Will. "Hale died in his shack," Will said, his voice hard and clear. "He was not fixing a roof. He was attacking a girl, one of the girls he trafficked, and she killed him. She defended herself, and I helped cover it up. I helped to save her from the rope, and Sheriff Brody agreed." Eliza picked up the story, the two of them a team, their voices weaving the truth. "He agreed," Eliza cried, "because he could not let the truth of his partnership with Hale come out. He blackmailed Will. He held that girl's life over him. He used it to own him, to silence him." "This is slander!" Brody yelled, his hand on his gun. "And then he came for Clara." Eliza pointed at the ruin. "She knew the truth, too. He arrested her on a false charge. I begged Dr. Miller to see her, and he refused. He said his hands were tied by the sheriff. I confronted Brody. I told him he was a killer, and he slapped me, in front of everyone at that saloon. And then, last night, he silenced her. For good. He locked her in her room and he burned that building to the ground." She held up the dress again. "This is not justice. This is not order. This is murder. This is your lawman." The crowd was a sea of pale, shocked faces. They looked from Eliza, standing like a prophetess in the ashes, to Will, chained and beaten, to their sheriff, his face purple with rage, his hand on his gun. The truth was out. Eliza's voice, raw and amplified by the cold, clear air, hung over the stunned silence of the town. The truth, all of it, the trafficking, the blackmail, the murder of Clara, the beating of Will, lay bare in the center of the street, as stark and ugly as the smoking ruin of the saloon. The town divided itself in that instant. "Lies!" a man shouted from the back, one of Brody's cronies from the saloon. "She is a hysterical whore. He is a known killer." "He is right," cried a woman, pulling her children close. "She came here to marry Hale, and now she sullies his name after betting his killer." But others looked at Will's chained wrist, at the deep, angry bruises on his face, at the spreading welt on Eliza's cheek where Brody had struck her. They looked at Dr. Miller, who was staring at his own feet, his face ashen with shame. He did come to me," Dr. Miller said, his voice a miserable, thin sound. "She begged me. I told her my hands were tied." "You coward!" Henderson, the mercantile owner, snapped. "You let him do this?" "He has paper on all of us," the doctor cried, his composure breaking. "My brother, he had a gambling debt. Brody, he owns us."
The admission cracked the foundations of the town. Suddenly, others saw their own compromises, their own small fears, their own silence. They had all, in their own way, been owned by Brody. The sheriff, seeing his authority disintegrating, seeing the crowd's fear turning to disgust, knew it was over. His deputies were looking at him, not with loyalty, but with doubt. He was alone. He did the only thing a coward could do. He ran. He shoved his way through the crowd, not toward his office, but toward the livery, toward his horse, toward escape. "He is running!" a man yelled. Will moved. He did not run. He walked. He stepped down from the trough and moved with a purpose that parted the crowd. He was still chained, still beaten, but he was no longer a prisoner. "Brody!" His voice was not a shout. It was a command. It echoed down the street, cold and flat. The sheriff froze, his hand on the livery door. He turned. His face was a mask of sweat and terror. He saw Will walking toward him, the broken chain dangling. "You are not running," Will said. It was not a question. Brody's eyes darted left and right. There was no escape. The town had formed a silent half-circle. He was trapped. His terror, cornered, curdled into rage. "You!" Brody spat, his hand dropping to his gun belt. "You ruined everything. You and that woman. I should have put you in the ground with hail." "You are done, Brody," Will said, stopping 20 paces away. "It is over." "It is over when I say it is," Brody roared. He was playing his last card. He was still the sheriff. He still had the badge. He still had the gun. "This is my town. I am the law, and you are a wanted man. Will, for threatening a lawman. For slander. I am calling you out." A collective gasp went through the crowd. A duel. "No, Will!" Eliza cried, starting forward. Will held up his chained hand. Stopping her, he looked at Brody. He had not worn a gun to kill. He had worn it to save, but he saw the look in Brody's eyes. The man was broken. He would not be taken. He would not go to a magistrate. He would finish this, one way or another. "Take off the chains," Will said to the deputy nearest him. The deputy, a young man who had looked up to Brody, now looked at his boss with contempt. He fumbled for his keys, unlocked the padlock, and the heavy chain clattered into the muddy snow. "Dawn," Brody said, his voice shaking. "Right here, Dawn." He turned and stalked into his office, slamming the door. The crowd dispersed, not to their beds, but to their homes, to wait. The night, which had been full of fire, was now full of a cold, terrible anticipation. Eliza ran to Will. "You cannot," she whispered, her hands on his chest, feeling the broken ribs beneath his torn shirt. "You are hurt. He will kill you." "He will try," Will said. He put his arm around her, his body aching, and began the slow walk back to the cabin. "Go home. Eliza, get the bandages." "I am not leaving you." "I know." They spent the last hours of the night in the small cabin. The fire was roaring now. Eliza had found his medical pouch from his old saddlebags. She cleaned his face again, the cuts sharp and deep. She wrapped his ribs tightly with clean linen, her hands gentle, her face a mask of stone. She was no longer crying. She was preparing her man for battle. "You do not have to do this," she said quietly, tying the last bandage. We could just go, now, in the dark." Will looked at her. He touched the angry purple bruise on her cheek. "And run, and let him win, let him chase us? No, it ends here, in this town, where it all started, for Clara, for you." He sat in the chair, the exhaustion pulling at him. He was not the man he had been. He was not the fast, cold killer from his past. He was tired. His body was broken. And for the first time in his life, he was terrified of dying. He had something to lose. He had her. I am
I am not him anymore. Eliza, he whispered into the firelight. I do not know if I can be him one last time. Eliza knelt in front of him. She took his scarred hands in hers. I do not love that man. I love the man who brought me honey. I love the man who sat in the dark and watched over me. I love the man who built a fire in this cold room. Be him. Be Will. That is all you need to be. The truth is on our side now. He nodded, his throat tight. He pulled her close and held her, breathing in the scent of her hair, of wood smoke, and of ashes. Dawn came. It was a cold, flat, gray light creeping over the eastern plains. The town was already there. They stood in a wide, silent circle in the middle of the street, their faces pale. The smoking ruin of the Red Slipper was their backdrop, a grim monument to the town's sins. Will walked out of the cabin. Eliza walked with him to the edge of the street. She stopped. She could not go farther. He squeezed her hand. Wait for me. He walked alone into the center of the street. He looked small. He was not the imposing killer of legend. He was just a man, bruised and bandaged, in a torn shirt. Brody emerged from his office. He had changed. He wore a clean black coat, his badge polished. He had been drinking. His face was flushed, and his eyes were too bright. He held a new, polished revolver. It did not have to be this way. Will! Brody called, his voice booming with false confidence. You should have just kept your head down. Will did not answer. He just stood, his hands loose at his sides. His face was calm. Henderson stepped forward. This is by the code. 10 paces. You will turn and fire on the count. Brody nodded curtly. Will nodded. They stood back to back. Eliza put her fist in her mouth, her knuckles white. She could not breathe. 1. Henderson counted, his voice shaking. They walked. 2. The crunch of their boots in the frozen mud. 3. Will's side was a sheet of fire. 4. He thought of Eliza. 5. He thought of Clara. 6. He thought of the curtain. 7. He was not a killer. 8. He was a protector. 9. He would not draw first. 10. They turned. Brody was fast. He was a bully, but he was fast, fueled by whiskey and terror. He drew and fired in one motion. The shot cracked through the dawn. Eliza screamed. The bullet slammed into Will, high on his left shoulder, spinning him half around. The pain was immense, a hot, liquid fire. He staggered, but he did not fall. Brody's face, triumphant for half a second, turned to a mask of shock. He had hit him. Why was he not down? Will's hand moved. It was not fast. It was slow. It was deliberate. It was the memory of 1,000 draws, guided not by hate, but by a cold, simple necessity. He raised his gun. His shoulder was screaming. His arm was numb, but he held it steady. Brody fumbled to cock his gun for a second shot. Will fired. 1 shot. The sound was flat, final. Brody stood frozen. He looked down. A small, dark hole had appeared in the center of his chest, right on his polished badge. He looked up at Will, his expression one of complete, utter surprise. Then he fell backward, dead before he hit the ground. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the loudest sound Eliza had ever heard. Then she was running. Will! Will! She reached him just as his legs gave out. He collapsed, not from the shot, but from the pain, the exhaustion, the release. He fell to his knees, and she caught him. You are hit, she cried, seeing the blood already soaking his shirt. It is just my shoulder, he gasped, his head falling against her. It is done, Eliza. It is done. Dr. Miller ran forward, his medical bag in hand. Let me see. Get him to the cabin, quickly.
Weeks passed. The duel, the death of the sheriff, the fire, it all settled, like ash, into the town's history. The federal magistrate came, investigated, and heard the testimony of Will, of Eliza, of Dr. Miller, and of a half-dozen other merchants Brody had blackmailed. The case was closed. Brody's death was ruled a lawful act of self-defense. The town of Stone Creek was, officially, free. Will survived. The bullet had torn through muscle but missed the bone. The fever that followed was worse. For 3 nights, Eliza sat by his side in the cabin, pressing cool cloths to his head, forcing broth between his lips. She did not sleep. She fought for him, holding his hand, whispering to him when he thrashed in his delirium. "You stay," she commanded him, her voice low and fierce. "You do not get to leave me, not now. You stay, Will." And he stayed. Spring came. It came slowly. Then, all at once, the deep, heavy snows melted, and the gray-brown prairie turned a shocking, vibrant green. The creek rushed with clear, cold water. The air smelled of damp earth and new life. And the town, like the land, began to thaw. They were left alone at first. The townsfolk were ashamed of their fear, their silence, their complicity. But slowly, tentatively, they reached out. One morning, Eliza found a pot of warm chicken soup on the cabin step. She looked up and saw Mrs. Gable, the widow, hurrying away, her black shawl held tight. A few days later, a small, shy girl, the blacksmith's daughter, approached the cabin. She held out a clumsy handful of purple crocuses. For you, ma'am," she whispered, and ran. Eliza put the flowers in a tin can on the table. Then the women came. First, Mrs. Henderson. She stood at the cabin door, her hands clasped, her face stiff with social awkwardness. "Miss Eliza," she said, not meeting her eyes, My daughter, Mary, is to be married. She requires a wedding dress." Eliza looked at the woman who had once condemned her. She saw the nervousness in her eyes, the silent plea for normalcy. "Come in," Eliza said, her voice soft. "Tell me what she likes." Her sewing shop was born. She was not a pariah. She was not a scandal. She was Eliza, the seamstress. As Will's strength returned, he began to work. He chopped wood, enough to last a year. He mended the roof. He planed the floorboards until they were smooth. And then he began to build a fence, not around the cabin, but on the small, sunlit hill behind it, overlooking the creek. He built a small, simple picket fence, and he painted it white with paint he had traded for his labor at the livery. Inside the small square, he broke the earth and planted seeds, wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, lupine, and yarrow. Eliza came out, shading her eyes from the bright spring sun. "What are you doing?" Will did not look up from his work. He pressed a seed into the dark, rich soil. "It is for Clara. She deserves her room with the morning sun." Eliza knelt beside him. She did not speak. She just put her hand on his, and together they planted the flowers. That evening, Eliza was finishing her last piece of work. It was not a dress. It was a curtain, a simple, white cotton curtain. Will watched her as she hung it in the cabin's single front window. "Eliza?" he asked, his voice hesitant. I thought you were done with hiding." She turned, the late sun coming through the thin fabric, making her glow. She smiled, a soft, private smile. "I am," she said. She ran her hand over the cotton. "This is not to hide. Will, it is to remember what it felt like to be on the other side, to remember what it feels like to be seen." The night was warm, the first truly warm night of spring. The door was open, and the sound of the creek and the chirping of crickets filled the small, clean room. The lamp cast a soft, golden light. Eliza blew out the lamp, leaving only the moonlight. She moved toward the window, and for a moment, she stepped behind the new curtain. The moon shone through, outlining her silhouette, a soft, womanly shadow against the white cotton. Will sat in the small chair he had built, watching her. His shoulder ached, but it was a good ache, an ache that had been earned. He said it quietly, his voice full of a peace he had never known. "I still see you." She smiled, a shadow's smile, and stepped out from behind the curtain. She came to him, the moonlight on her skin, on her plain cotton nightgown. She knelt by his chair, took his scarred hand, and kissed the knuckles. "I've been aching down there," she whispered, the words no longer a confession of shame, but a declaration. "But not from pain, from loving you." He pulled her up onto his lap, his good arm wrapping around her, pulling her close. He kissed her. It was not the desperate, hungry kiss of the storeroom. It was not the grim, ash-filled kiss of the ruins. It was the warm, slow, tender kiss of a husband, of a home. The past was behind them, a scar, like the ones they both bore. But the ache, the long, lonely ache of their hidden lives, had finally and completely been met. Thank you for listening to our story. Comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.